At 7:43 a.m., doctors declared this boy dead, but someone in that hospital knew the truth.
Imagine you're 8 years old. You're lying completely still on a cold hospital bed. You cannot move. You cannot speak. You cannot cry out for the help that is standing just a few feet away from you. The room is bright and sterile and full of people who chose their profession because they wanted to save lives. And one by one, every single one of them looks in your direction, turns around, and walks out the door. Not because there was nothing they could do, not because the situation was beyond saving, but because someone had already paid for that outcome. Someone had already made the decision, long before that morning, that your life was not worth the trouble it caused them. That is not fiction. That is not a dramatization. That is the story of a real child in a real hospital on a real morning that began like any other and ended in a way that nobody, not the investigators, not the journalists, not even the people who had been watching Richard Harlow for years, had seen coming. And the only reason that child drew another breath that day was because of a boy who had nothing. No home, no family, no reason in the world to stop. But he stopped anyway. And what followed, that single act of courage would expose one of the most calculated, cold-blooded cover-ups this country had seen in years. Before we go any further, go ahead and drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you're new to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let us begin at the very beginning. Richard Harlow was not born powerful. That was the thing he made sure everyone knew. He had built his empire from what he publicly described as a single room, a borrowed desk, and a refusal to quit. He said it in interviews. He said it in speeches. He said it at charity dinners where people paid thousands of dollars a seat to hear him talk about resilience and vision and the kind of relentless drive that separates the people who make it from the people who do not. By the time the events of this story unfolded, Richard Harlow was 54 years old, the founder and majority owner of a commercial real estate company that operated across Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, and the Carolinas. His name was on buildings. His face was on the covers of regional business publications. He had been married once, divorced quietly, and had, as far as the public record was concerned, no children. He lived in a 12,000 square foot property outside Nashville, traveled by private car, and employed a staff of 9 people whose primary function was to make sure that Richard Harlow's life ran exactly the way Richard Harlow wanted it to run. He was, by every outward measure, a man who had complete control over his world. But the thing about control, the thing that men like Richard Harlow never fully accept until it's too late, is that it is always an illusion. You can manage information. You can manage appearances. You can manage the people around you through money and pressure and the quiet, suffocating weight of your resources. But you cannot manage everything. And the one thing Richard had never been able to fully manage, no matter how much money he threw at the problem, was the existence of his son. Caleb had been born approximately 9 years before the morning this story reaches its center point. His mother, whom we will call Serena Walsh, had met Richard at a business function in Nashville during a period when Richard was still building his reputation and moving fast through a world of deals and late nights and carefully curated social appearances. Serena was 31 years old at the time. She was warm and intelligent and had a quiet, grounded quality that people who knew her described consistently and always with the same word: genuine. She was not part of Richard's world. She did not come from money. She worked in marketing, lived in a one-bedroom apartment in East Nashville, and had built a life that was modest and stable and entirely her own. She and Richard began a relationship that lasted close to 2 years. It was not, by Serena's account, something she had approached casually. She had believed for a significant portion of those 2 years that it was heading somewhere real. That Richard, despite the gap between their circumstances, despite the way his world operated on rules that were different from the ones she had grown up with, genuinely cared about her. She was wrong, and she found out how wrong she was in the worst possible way at the worst possible moment when she told him she was pregnant. Richard's response was not anger. It was not confusing. It was not the kind of complicated emotional reaction that a man who had genuinely loved someone might have when faced with unexpected news. It was immediate, calculated, and entirely focused on one thing: the problem this pregnancy presented to his plans. He was in the early stages of the most significant business expansion of his career, a merger that had been years in the making, with partners who had conducted thorough due diligence on every aspect of his professional and personal life. His image was part of the deal, his stability, his control, a child born outside of marriage, to a woman no one in his circle had ever met, was not a complication he was willing to absorb. He told Serena this clearly. He offered her money, a significant amount. He wanted her to relocate, raise the child quietly, and keep his name entirely out of it. Serena refused. She was not naive about what she was refusing. She understood that Richard had resources she could not match. She understood that pushing back against a man like him came with consequences. But she refused anyway because she believed, and continued to believe for longer than was probably good for her, that there was a version of this situation in which Richard would come around, in which he would look at his child and feel something that overrode his calculations. She was waiting for the part of him that she had believed existed during those 2 years together to resurface. It never did. What followed was a slow, methodical campaign of pressure that Serena later described to investigators in precise and heartbreaking detail. Her apartment lease was not renewed. The property management company that handled the building had a contract with one of Richard's subsidiary companies, something Serena had not known when she moved in and only discovered much later. Her employer, a small marketing agency that handled contracts within Richard's business network, let her go without explanation 3 months after she told Richard about the pregnancy. She was not given a formal reason. She was not eligible for the severance that her contract had promised. When she consulted a lawyer, she was told that the case would be difficult and expensive, and that the agency's connection to Richard's network made the legal terrain complicated in ways that a straightforward wrongful termination case usually was not. The lawyer advised her to consider her options carefully. She understood what that meant. She was being told, without anyone saying it directly, that she was already outmatched. Still, she pushed back. She documented everything. She saved every message. She kept a record of every conversation, every pressure point, every moment where the coincidences stacked up in patterns that were too deliberate to be accidental. She was building a case. She believed that the truth, properly documented and clearly presented, would protect her and protect her son. She was not yet living in the world as it actually was. She was still living in the world as she believed it should work. Caleb was born in the spring in a hospital in Nashville, with Serena's sister as her only support in the delivery room. He was healthy. He was beautiful. Serena described the first time she held him as the moment everything else stopped mattering. Whatever was happening with Richard, whatever pressure was being applied from whatever direction, none of it touched that moment. Caleb was hers. He was real, and she was going to protect him. For the first 2 years of Caleb's life, Serena managed. It was hard. The financial pressure Richard had engineered had significantly reduced her options, but she had found work, found a smaller apartment, found a rhythm that was fragile but functional. Richard did not acknowledge Caleb publicly. He did not visit. He did not send money voluntarily. But through the legal process Serena had initiated, a paternity and child support case that moved with the exhausting slowness of a system not designed to work quickly, there was at least a record, at least an acknowledgement, in legal documents if not in any practical or emotional sense, that Richard Harlow was this child's father. And then, when Caleb was around 2 years old, Richard's lawyers made a new approach. No pressure this time. An offer. They wanted to meet. They wanted to discuss an arrangement. Serena went cautiously with her own lawyer present. The offer on the table was significant. A house, fully paid, in a location of Serena's choosing outside of Tennessee. a financial settlement large enough to cover all foreseeable expenses for both Serena and Caleb through adulthood. College funds, healthcare, everything accounted for. In exchange, Serena would sign a comprehensive agreement. She would relocate. She would not contact Richard. She would not speak publicly about their relationship or about Caleb's parentage. She would adopt a different surname for herself and for Caleb to prevent casual discovery. And she would surrender primary custody of Caleb to Richard, who would raise him through staff in practice at the Nashville property. The custody element was the one that broke Serena. She did not want to give up her son. She fought it through her lawyer for weeks. But Richard's team had prepared for this. They had compiled a file on Serena's circumstances, the apartment, the employment gaps, the financial instability, and presented it as evidence that Caleb's best interests were served by the stability Richard could provide. In the state of Tennessee, at that time, with the legal resources Richard had at his disposal and the limitations Serena was working within, her lawyer told her plainly that a custody battle would be long, expensive, and carried a genuine risk of an outcome worse than the one being offered. Serena signed. She signed because she believed she had no other choice. She signed because she was exhausted and frightened, and because the lawyer sitting across from her had the kind of calm confidence that comes from having never lost a case against someone in Serena's position. She relocated to Kentucky. She took the money. She changed her name, and she tried every single day for years afterward to build a life around an absence that never stopped hurting. What Richard told Caleb when the boy was old enough to ask about his mother was simple and final and entirely false. He told him that Serena had died in a car accident when Caleb was very young. He told him that she had loved him very much and that it was a tragedy and that they did not need to talk about it often because talking about it too much made the grief harder to carry. Caleb accepted this because he was a child, and children accept the realities they are given, especially when those realities are delivered by the only parent they have. He grieved his mother in the quiet, private way that children grieve things they do not fully understand. Not in dramatic gestures, but in small, accumulated absences. A question not asked because he knew the answer would hurt. A space in his imagination where she should have been. He was, by the accounts of the few adults who spent sustained time with him during those years, tutors, nannies, a housekeeper named Dorothy, who would later speak to investigators with a kind of careful, pained honesty, a deeply lonely child, intelligent, curious, sweet-natured in a way that seemed almost defiant given the coldness of his environment, but lonely in the particular way of children who have learned not to need too much from the people around them, because needing too much has already taught them something they were too young to learn. Caleb's seizure disorder had been identified when he was 6 years old. It was not a rare or particularly severe condition in the context of what modern medicine could offer. A pediatric neurologist at a hospital in Nashville had given Richard a clear, thorough explanation of the condition, its triggers, its management protocol, and its prognosis with proper treatment. The prognosis with proper treatment was excellent. Caleb could expect to live a completely normal life with appropriate medication, regular monitoring, and a caregiving environment that was educated about how to respond in the event of an episode. Richard had sat through that consultation. He had received the written materials. He had, to all appearances in that room, understood. But in the months that followed, the implementation of Caleb's treatment plan was inconsistent at best. Medication was prescribed, but not always administered on schedule. Follow-up appointments were kept sometimes and missed other times. The nannies who were responsible for Caleb's day-to-day care were often not fully briefed on his condition because, according to Dorothy, the housekeeper, Richard had instructed the household staff to handle Caleb's medical matters quietly and without drawing attention from visitors or business associates who might be present at the property. He found the condition embarrassing. That was the word Dorothy used. Embarrassing. As though a child's neurological health was a reflection on the man who had fathered him and therefore needed to be managed the same way every other inconvenient reality in Richard Harlow's life was managed. quietly, invisibly, and in a way that left no marks on the surface of things. By the time Caleb was 7, he had experienced several seizure episodes at home. None of them had been life-threatening with the care that was available, but each one had underscored the importance of consistent medication and proper supervision. Dorothy had raised her concerns to Richard directly on at least 2 occasions. She had been told, politely but firmly, to focus on her responsibilities and leave medical decisions to those qualified to make them. A few months after her second attempt to raise the issue, Dorothy was let go. The official reason given was a restructuring of household staff. She did not believe that was the real reason. She had seen the emails, not intentionally. She had been asked to print documents from Richard's home office on more than one occasion. And on one of those occasions, the document that came through was not what she had been asked to print. It was an email. And what it said was enough to make her hands shake as she stood at that printer in Richard's study on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She did not print it. She closed the document. She went back to her work. And she spent the next 3 months trying to decide what to do with what she had seen. She had not yet figured out the answer to that question when she was dismissed. After that, she told herself she had no standing, no evidence, no way to make anyone listen. She was a housekeeper who had glimpsed a single email on a printer. She told herself that. She kept telling herself that for a long time, until investigators knocked on her door and she realized that what she had seen, combined with everything else they had already found, was exactly the kind of detail that locks a case into place. The Dr. Richard had been communicating with in those emails was a man we will call Dr. Franklin. Dr. Franklin had been a legitimate physician earlier in his career, licensed, practiced, associated with reputable institutions. But a series of decisions over approximately a decade had moved him steadily away from legitimate practice and into an arrangement with Richard Harlow that was, by any honest description, the corruption of everything a medical license is supposed to represent. Richard had first connected with Dr. Franklin through a mutual associate approximately 7 years before that March morning. At that time, Dr. Franklin had been dealing with a professional and financial situation complicated enough that Richard's offer of a private retainer, substantial, reliable, and requiring a particular kind of discretion, had been difficult to refuse. The relationship had deepened over the years. Dr. Franklin handled medical matters for Richard and for people within Richard's network that required privacy rather than documentation. Matters that could not go through standard channels, because standard channels created records, and records created accountability, and accountability was the one thing that people in Richard's position spent enormous energy avoiding. By the time the emails that investigators would eventually recover were written, Dr. Franklin was not a doctor making medical decisions. He was a contractor executing a client's instructions. And the instructions, laid out across a chain of emails spanning 9 months, were among the most calculated and deliberately cruel things the lead investigator on the case said he had ever read in 22 years of law enforcement. The plan was not spontaneous. That is the thing that has to be understood about what Richard Harlow did. It was not a moment of desperation or poor judgment or the kind of terrible decision that a person makes in a panic and spends the rest of their life regretting. It was planned. It was discussed in writing across dozens of exchanges. It was refined and adjusted and approached with the same strategic thinking that Richard applied to his business dealings. Caleb's seizure disorder was the mechanism. The condition that Richard had never properly managed, the condition that he had deliberately allowed to remain undertreated, was now going to serve a purpose. Dr. Franklin would be present when an episode occurred. The episode would be allowed to progress further than it should before any intervention was made. And in the chaos and urgency of the aftermath, Dr. Franklin would make the medical determination that Caleb had not survived. The documentation would be handled by Dr. Franklin. The death would be registered before any other medical personnel could independently assess the situation. And Caleb, the liability, the inconvenient truth, the child whose existence threatened the most important deal of Richard Harlow's career, would simply cease to be a problem. The merger that Richard was protecting with his plan was valued at just over $400 million. His partners were two investment groups, one based in Atlanta and one with significant ties to institutional investors in New York. Due diligence on Richard's background had been ongoing for months and was approaching its final stages. His legal team had flagged Caleb's existence as a potential issue not because the child himself represented any legal problem, but because the circumstances of his birth, the suppressed paternity, the paid disappearance of his mother, the falsified death record that Richard had never officially filed but had told multiple people over the years was the truth, created a web of exposure that, if it unraveled at the wrong moment, could raise questions about Richard's character and judgment that his partners would not be willing to overlook. Richard's lawyer had advised him, in terms that were carefully constructed to be deniable in retrospect, that a clean resolution of any outstanding personal complexities before the deal closed would be in everyone's interest. Richard had interpreted this advice in a way that his particular combination of arrogance, resources, and complete absence of moral restraint made it inevitable. He would create a clean resolution. And on the morning of March 3rd, he set that resolution in motion. He arrived at Mercy General Hospital at approximately 6:15 in the morning, using a side entrance and an access code that Dr. Franklin had obtained through a connection within the hospital's administrative network. Caleb was with him, unconscious, having experienced a seizure episode the previous evening that had been allowed to run its course without the medication that should have been administered at the first sign of onset. The child had been in a state of post-seizure exhaustion through the night, unresponsive in the way that was not uncommon after a significant episode, but that was, in Caleb's case, more severe than it would have been if his condition had been properly managed across the preceding months. Richard had carried him from the car. He had walked through that side entrance without checking in at reception, without presenting identification, without creating any of the standard documentation that a hospital admission generates. He had gone directly to a room that Dr. Franklin had arranged to be available, a room on a lower floor, away from the main wards, in a section of the hospital that saw minimal foot traffic in the early morning hours. And he had placed his son on that bed and stepped back and waited for Dr. Franklin to do what he had been paid to do. Dr. Franklin examined Caleb. The examination lasted 11 minutes, according to the room's entry and exit log, one of the small, almost incidental pieces of digital record keeping that would later become significant in ways Richard had not accounted for. Dr. Franklin then went to the nursing station on that floor and spoke to the nurse on duty, a young woman named Dana Collier, who was in only her third week on the job. He told her that the child in room 7 had been brought in by family, that he had assessed the situation, and that the child was non-responsive with no viable signs of life. He told her to complete the relevant paperwork. Dana Collier was 23 years old. She had not yet developed the professional instincts that come with experience, the quiet internal alarm that sounds when something does not add up, when a situation has the texture of wrongness even before you can identify exactly what is wrong. She was 3 weeks into her career in a hospital being instructed by a doctor. She did what she was told. She completed the paperwork. And at 7:43 in the morning, Caleb Harlow was officially declared dead. Richard signed a form. He spoke briefly with Dr. Franklin in the hallway. He did not look back at the room where his son was lying. He walked to the side entrance and got into his car and drove to the Hermitage Hotel, where he had a breakfast meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock. He ordered eggs. He answered emails. He was, by every account of those who saw him that morning, entirely composed. Dana Collier went back to her station. Dr. Franklin left the building. The room where Caleb lay was quiet. Nobody checked on him. Nobody was supposed to. He had been declared dead. There was nothing left to check on, except that Caleb was not dead. He was unconscious and fragile, and his body was doing the slow, effortful work of recovery that it always did after a severe episode. His chest was rising and falling in shallow, barely visible movements. His fingers, if anyone had been watching closely, made small involuntary movements against the sheets. He was alive, and he was alone. And if nothing had changed in the next few minutes, that would not have remained true for very long. Marcus had come in from the rain. The temperature that morning had dropped sharply overnight, and the stretch of street between the shelter where he had spent the previous night and the food kitchen 3 blocks east of the hospital was cold in the particular way of early March mornings in Tennessee. Not the deep cold of January, but a damp, cutting cold that worked its way through thin fabric with a patience that felt almost personal. He had found the side door propped open as he had found it before, the mop bucket wedged in the gap, the warm air coming through in a slow drift that felt like an invitation. He slipped inside. He intended to stand in the corridor for 20 minutes, maybe half an hour, until the feeling came back to his hands and the worst of the morning chill had passed. He was not supposed to be there. He knew that. He moved quietly, close to the wall, the way he had learned to move in spaces that were not his, taking up as little room as possible, making as little noise as possible, being as invisible as possible. He had almost reached the alcove near the laundry bay where he usually waited when he passed the door of room 7. It was slightly ajar, not open, just open enough. And Marcus, who noticed everything, noticed that too. He stopped. He was not sure, afterward, exactly what made him stop. Something about the angle of the gap, or the quality of the stillness inside, or some instinct developed through years of reading environments quickly and accurately because getting it wrong had consequences. He looked through the gap, and he saw Caleb. He saw a small child lying on a hospital bed in a room with the overhead lights at half setting, completely still, in the kind of stillness that Marcus had seen before in people who were in serious trouble. He had seen it in the shelter. Men who had been drinking too long, women who had gone too far with substances, people whose bodies had reached a point where they could no longer maintain the performance of being okay. He knew what that stillness looked like. And something in him, something that had been built by his own years of being the person nobody noticed, being the person who needed help that nobody came to provide, would not let him walk past it. He pushed the door open. He went to bed. He looked at Caleb, and he said something quietly, some form of "Are you okay?" and got nothing back. He put his hand on Caleb's arm and felt how cold it was and felt the faint but unmistakable rise and fall of breathing and understood immediately that this child was not dead, but was also very much not okay. What Marcus did next was not trained, and it was not technically correct, and it would not have passed any evaluation by any medical professional. What it was human and desperate and driven by an absolute refusal to be the person who walked away. He had seen CPR attempted once in a shelter when an older man had collapsed in the common room. He had watched what the shelter worker did. He had not cataloged it consciously as information he was storing for future use. But his hands remembered it in the vague, approximate way that observation lodges in the body when you are watching something that matters. He ran cold water from the sink in the corner of the room over a cloth and pressed it to Caleb's face. He pressed on his chest, not quite right, not quite the correct depth or rhythm, but with enough force and enough persistence that something in Caleb's system responded to the interruption. He called out, not loudly. He was still trying to stay invisible even in the middle of this, but clearly and repeatedly, calling Caleb back for wherever he had gone. And Caleb gasped. It was not a dramatic movie gasp. It was a small, rough, desperate intake of breath, the sound of a body reasserting itself against the direction it had been heading. Marcus stepped back. He did not know what to do next. He had done everything he knew how to do, and it had worked, and now he was an 11-year-old boy standing in a hospital room where he was not supposed to be, next to a child who had just been declared dead, but was very much breathing. And he had no framework for what came after this. He did the only thing that made sense. He went to the door and he called out into the corridor for help. He called out twice, 3 times, his voice louder now than it had been, the invisibility no longer the priority. And that was when Dana Collier, returning from a supply closet at the end of the hall, heard him. What Dana experienced when she walked into that room was, by her own description, something she was not fully able to process in real time. She had signed paperwork declaring this child deceased. She had done it less than 20 minutes ago. She had done it because a doctor had told her to. And here was this child breathing, not recovered, not stable, not in any sense fine, but breathing, eyes moving behind closed lids, small sounds coming from his throat that were unmistakably the sounds of a living person. And here was a boy in a torn jacket and wet shoes standing at the bedside looking at her with an expression that was equal parts terror and defiance. Dana's hands were shaking. She would describe that detail specifically months later when she spoke to investigators, the shaking of her hands as she reached for the call button, as she pressed it and kept pressing it, as the corridor outside the room filled with the sound of rapidly approaching footsteps. She told the investigator that she kept thinking over and over in those seconds between pressing the call button and the first responders arriving, that she had signed a paper. She had signed a paper saying this child was dead, and she could not understand yet what that meant. She only knew that it was wrong, that something had gone very, very wrong in this building, and that the homeless boy standing next to the bed was the only reason anyone was going to have the chance to figure out what. The ward was in controlled chaos within minutes. Caleb was moved to the ICU. The attending physician who took over his care, a doctor named Dr. Anita Reeves, who had been in emergency medicine for 16 years, assessed him rapidly and thoroughly and made a series of decisions in quick succession that stabilized his condition within the hour. Dr. Reeves had not been in the hospital when Caleb was brought in. She had arrived for her shift at 7:30, signed in at the main reception, and had been on her way to her first rounds when the call button from the lower corridor had activated. When she reviewed the paperwork that Dana had completed and saw the timestamp, and then looked at the child in front of her, she did not immediately know what she was dealing with. But she knew that what she was looking at did not match what the paperwork said. And Dr. Anita Reeves, in 16 years of emergency medicine, had developed exactly the kind of professional instinct that Dana Collier had not yet had the chance to build. The alarm that sounds when something does not add up. She finished stabilizing Caleb, and then she picked up the phone and made a call that was not to another doctor. She called the hospital's patient safety officer. She told him that she had a situation that needed to be looked at carefully and immediately, and that she believed the circumstances of this child's admission and the documentation surrounding it warranted an urgent internal review. The patient safety officer called the hospital director. The hospital director called legal. Legal called the police. Marcus, in the meantime, was sitting in a plastic chair in the corridor outside the room where Caleb had been taken. A nurse had brought him a cup of hot chocolate from the staff kitchen. He had not been asked to leave. Whether this was because in the urgency of everything else that was happening, nobody had thought to address the presence of a child in a wet jacket in the corridor, or whether it was because Dana Collier had said, quietly but firmly, to the first person who suggested moving him that he was staying, Marcus had remained in that chair. He had not given his full name to anyone who asked. He had said his first name, Marcus, and then gone quiet in the way that he had learned was the safest response to adult questions in institutional settings. He did not know what was going to happen. He did not know what he had walked into. He only knew that the boy in that room had been breathing when they took him away, and he was not leaving until he had heard something more definitive than that. The police officers who arrived at Mercy General that morning were from the Clarksville Metro Police Department. The initial call had been framed as a potential incident involving incorrect medical documentation, language calibrated by the hospital's legal team to be accurate without being inflammatory in a way that created public visibility before the facts were clearer. The two officers who responded were not homicide detectives. They were patrol officers responding to what had been communicated to them as a hospital administrative irregularity. They took statement from Dana and from the attending administrator on duty. They reviewed the paperwork. They looked at the admission log. They noted the access code used at the side entrance and ran it through the hospital's records. The code was registered to Dr. Franklin's credentials. Dr. Franklin was not scheduled to be in the building that morning. He had not checked in through standard reception. There was no record of him in the visitor log or the physician's sign-in sheet. The only record of his presence was the access log at the side door and the paperwork that Dana had completed based on his instructions. One of the officers stepped into the corridor to make a call. He called his sergeant. He explained what he was looking at. His sergeant called the detective division, and by mid-morning, this had stopped being a hospital administrative irregularity and had become a criminal investigation. Richard Harlow, at the Hermitage Hotel, received a call from his personal assistant at 9:47 in the morning. The assistant told him that there had been a development at the hospital. Richard's response, according to the assistant, who would later provide a detailed account to investigators, was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds, followed by a request to repeat the information, followed by a calm instruction to connect him with his legal team immediately. He did not ask if Caleb was alive. He did not ask what had happened or how Caleb had been found or what the child's condition was. The first words out of Richard Harlow's mouth after being told that his son had been found alive in a hospital room where he had been declared dead were not the words of a father. They were the words of a man assessing damage. He ended the call with his assistant and began making other calls. 4 of them in the span of 8 minutes. 2 to lawyers, 1 to Dr. Franklin, 1 to a number that would later be traced to an offshore communications line. The content of those calls was not immediately available to investigators, but the metadata was the timing, the sequence, the duration. And in the context of everything else, it told a story that did not require much interpretation. By noon, a hospital employee had contacted a journalist at a local news station. The tip was specific enough to be credible and vague enough to require verification, and the journalist, a woman named Patricia Dunmore who had covered the health beat in Clarksville for 7 years, went to the hospital and began making inquiries. She did not get far through official channels on that first day, but she was there when someone, a person who has never been publicly identified, took a photograph on a phone. The photograph showed Marcus. He was still in the corridor, still in his wet jacket, still in the plastic chair. He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and he was looking at the door of the room where Caleb had been taken with an expression that Patricia Dunmore, when she saw the photograph, described as the most concentrated form of hope she had ever seen on a human face. Someone uploaded that photograph to social media. By 3 in the afternoon, it had been shared 40,000 times. By midnight, it had crossed 200,000. The caption that accompanied it, written by whoever had taken it, read simply, "The boy they said couldn't be saved, and the boy who refused to believe them." People did not know the names. They did not know the details. But something in that image, 2 children, one invisible to the world and one made invisible by money and power, connected by an act of ordinary human courage, landed with a force that bypassed every rational filter and went straight to whatever part of people responds to the thing they most need to believe is still true. Patricia Dunmore had been a journalist long enough to know when a story was bigger than it appeared on its surface. She spent the next 48 hours making calls, pulling public records, cross-referencing the access code registration with Dr. Franklin's licensure history, and running Richard Harlow's name through every database available to her. What she found sent her to her editor immediately. The story that began to emerge was not a story about a hospital error. It was a story about a man who had orchestrated the deliberate suppression of his own child's life for the protection of a financial deal. Her editor contacted the station's legal team. They were careful. They published what they could verify and held what they could not. But even the verified surface of the story was enough to ignite a national conversation that Richard Harlow's lawyers had absolutely no prepared response to, because the last thing they had anticipated was that any of this would surface at all. The plan had failed at the single point where it was most vulnerable, the assumption that no one would be in that room. The assumption that a declared dead child in a quiet corner of a hospital on an early morning would remain undiscovered long enough for the documentation to harden into reality. That assumption had been broken by an 11-year-old boy in a torn jacket who came in from the cold. The Tennessee Department of Children's Services opened an emergency investigation within 24 hours of the story breaking. The district attorney's office followed 2 days later. Investigators moved quickly and with a focus that reflected both the urgency of the situation and the awareness, shared by everyone involved, that the longer this took, the more opportunity Richard's legal resources had to shape the narrative. The first priority was Caleb's safety and medical care. He remained in the ICU for 4 days, receiving the properly managed treatment for his seizure disorder that he should have been receiving for years. Dr. Reeves oversaw his care personally. She described him, in a later interview, as a child who was medically more fragile than he should have been given his age and the treatability of his condition, but who responded well and rapidly once the correct treatment was consistently administered. He was alert within 48 hours. He asked, on the morning of the 3rd day, whether the boy who had helped him was okay. Nobody had told him about Marcus. He had heard voices at the edge of his consciousness during the worst of it, and he had held on to that. The nurses told him that the boy was fine. Caleb said, okay, and was quiet for a moment, and then asked if he could send him something. They asked what he wanted to send. He thought about it for a while, and then said he wanted to send him a blanket because he looked cold in the picture someone had shown him on their phone. The investigation into Richard Harlow moved along 2 parallel tracks. The first was the criminal investigation, led by Detective Raymond Price of the Clarksville Criminal Investigations Division, working in coordination with the DA's office. Detective Price had 22 years of experience, most of it in cases involving financial crime and fraud, which made him an unusual but ultimately appropriate choice for a case that was, at its core, as much about money and calculation as it was about the direct harm to a child. The second track was the civil investigation conducted by DCS, focused on the full history of Caleb's care, the circumstances of Serena's disappearance, and the broader question of how this situation had been allowed to develop over years without any protective mechanism intervening. Both investigations quickly identified the same central evidentiary target: Richard's private communications. His lawyers moved immediately to resist access. They filed motions. They argued about privilege. They sought delays. The legal maneuvering was sophisticated and temporarily effective, buying enough time that the initial warrant for Richard's communication server was challenged and partially stayed for 11 days. But the emails existed. They were on a server. And Detective Price had enough from the external evidence: the access log, Dana Collier's statement, the admission paperwork, Dr. Franklin's licensure records, the testimony of Dorothy, the former housekeeper, who called the tip line the morning after the story broke, to keep the investigation moving forward while the warrant was contested. Dr. Franklin, for his part, had retained his own lawyer within hours of the story going public. His lawyer made contact with the DA's office on the 2nd day and indicated that Dr. Franklin might be open to a conversation about cooperation. This was not surprising to anyone involved. Dr. Franklin was not Richard Harlow. He did not have Richard's resources, Richard's network, or Richard's particular brand of cold confidence in the face of exposure. He was a man who had made a series of compromises over a decade that had brought him to a hospital room at 6:30 in the morning, participating in the staged death of an 8-year-old boy, and the distance between who he had once been and what he had just done was not something he was able to maintain the psychological coherence to defend. His lawyer and the prosecution spent 5 days in negotiation. Dr. Franklin agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge, 1 count of filing a false medical report, and a sentencing recommendation of supervised probation. Whether that arrangement reflected the value of his testimony or the limitations of the case, without it is something that legal observers have continued to debate. What is not debatable is that once Dr. Franklin began talking, the shape of Richard Harlow's plan became fully visible for the first time. The emails were released under the warrant 2 weeks after Caleb was found. Detective Price and the 2 analysts assigned to his team spent 3 days going through them in sequence. What they contained was a 9-month record of a plan built in careful, deliberate increments. There were emails in which Dr. Franklin raised logistical concerns and Richard addressed them methodically. There were emails in which the language shifted and softened in ways that both men seemed to understand as protective, references to the situation being resolved, to the liability being managed, to the arrangement being finalized, language that required interpretation, but that in the context of what had actually happened did not require much. There was one email sent by Richard to Dr. Franklin approximately 6 weeks before March 3rd that the prosecutor would later read aloud in court. It was 5 sentences long. Detective Price, reading it for the first time in his office on a Wednesday afternoon, put it down on his desk and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment before picking it up again. He had seen a great deal in 22 years. He had not seen that. Dorothy, the housekeeper, when investigators came to her door and showed her the email they had found on the server, confirmed that what she had seen at the printer in Richard's study years earlier had been from the same chain of correspondence. She had not been wrong about what it meant. She had just been too afraid, too uncertain of her standing, too conditioned by the power differential between herself and the man she had worked for to act on it. She cried when she made that confirmation. She cried for a long time, and then she gave a full statement that lasted 4 hours. The arrest of Richard Harlow took place on a Tuesday morning, 17 days after Caleb had been found alive. 2 detective vehicles and a patrol unit arrived at the Nashville property at 8 in the morning. Richard's lawyer had been notified the previous evening that an arrest was imminent and had spent those hours preparing a public statement. Richard came to the door in a suit. It was noted by the arresting officers that he was dressed as though he had been expecting them. He was cooperative and composed throughout the process. He said nothing beyond what his lawyer had instructed him to say, which was nothing. The statement released by his legal team later that morning described Richard as a grieving father who had been misled by medical professionals and who was fully confident that the truth would vindicate him completely. The language was polished and the delivery was precise, and for a percentage of the public who encountered it before they had read the details of the case, it carried a surface plausibility that it absolutely did not deserve. For the journalists and investigators and legal professionals who had spent the preceding weeks building the case, it was the last performance of a narrative that had already collapsed. Richard was charged on 3 counts: criminal endangerment of a child, filing a false death report, and conspiracy, in concert with Dr. Franklin, to defraud the state through the deliberate falsification of official records. He was released on bond. A bond set high enough to reflect the severity of the charges, but not high enough, given his resources, to be an actual constraint. His lead attorney, a man named Griffin who had handled Richard's legal affairs for over a decade, and whose fee structure reflected the premium end of what a $400 million deal could support, began constructing a defense that rested on 2 pillars. The first was that Richard had been deceived by Dr. Franklin, genuinely believing that Caleb had died from a natural complication of his seizure disorder and that the documentation had been handled appropriately by the physician in attendance. The second was that whatever the nature of the emails, they were subject to multiple interpretations, that the language used was ambiguous, that the prosecution's reading of them was one reading among several possible readings, and that the standard of proof required for criminal conviction had not been met. It was a defense built for a jury, not for the public. The public had already reached its verdict. The $400 million merger collapsed on the day the emails were made public. The Atlanta Investment Group released a brief statement expressing their decision to withdraw from the transaction pending a review of the circumstances. The New York Group said nothing publicly, but was understood within the business community to have communicated the same position through private channels. The deal that Richard had built for years, the deal that had been the stated justification, in the coldest possible sense of that word, for everything he had done to his son, was gone before he had even been formally arraigned. People who followed Richard's career noted the specific irony of this outcome, that the thing he had destroyed his child to protect had been destroyed by the exposure of what he had done to protect it. It was not a comfort. Irony rarely is in situations involving children and the adults who were supposed to keep them safe. The discovery of Serena Walsh happened through a process that the DCS investigators described as following the threads. Once the full facts of Caleb's situation were established, the question of his mother became central. The death certificate Richard had cited when explaining Serena's absence to Caleb had never been formally filed through any official channel. There was a document prepared on letterhead that did not correspond to any actual institution, stating that a woman of Serena's name had died in a vehicular accident in a specific county on a specific date. When investigators cross-referenced that date with the accident records for that county, there was no corresponding incident. The document was fabricated. It had been good enough to satisfy the casual questions of household staff and tutors, none of whom had any reason to verify it independently. It had not been good enough to survive scrutiny by people who were paid to verify things. Investigators began looking for Serena. It took 11 days. She had changed her name as required by the settlement agreement and had built a quiet life in a small town in western Kentucky, working in a library, attending a local church, maintaining the kind of deliberate low profile that the settlement terms had both required and, in a way, made necessary for her own psychological survival. She had told almost no one about Caleb. She carried his loss in private, the way people carry losses they cannot explain, because the full explanation implicates a world of power and influence that the listener will find difficult to believe. The investigator who called Serena was a woman named Janet Odom, a senior case manager with DCS who had been in Family Protective Services for 19 years. She was experienced in delivering difficult information. She had done it hundreds of times. She was not prepared, she later said, for what it was like to tell a mother that her son, the son she had been told was dead, the son she had grieved for years, the son whose absence had shaped the entire architecture of her daily life since the moment it happened, was alive. She said that the sound Serena made when she understood what she was being told was unlike anything she had heard before. It was not a word. It was not a cry. It was something that did not have a category. Janet Odom held the phone and listened to it and did not try to say anything for a long moment. Some things require the space to exist before you try to fill them with words. Serena arrived in Clarksville 7 days later, having been connected with a legal advocate through DCS and having begun the formal process of reestablishing her identity and her parental rights. The settlement agreement she had signed years before was being reviewed by the state attorney's office for elements that constituted coercive contract. The consensus among the legal professionals who examined was that multiple provisions would not survive a challenge given the circumstances under which they had been signed. Serena had signed under duress, in a position of manufactured vulnerability, without access to independent legal counsel of sufficient depth to identify the full implications of what she was agreeing to. There was a process ahead of her. There was paperwork and hearings and the slow institutional work of undoing years of deliberate damage. But the destination of that process was not in doubt. Caleb had a mother. She was alive. She had never stopped being his mother, and she was coming to him. Caleb was still in the hospital when Serena arrived. He was no longer in the ICU. He had moved to a general pediatric room 4 days earlier and was, by all medical accounts, recovering well. He was sitting up. He was eating. He was drawing with the color markers someone had brought him. He had been told, carefully and gently by a child psychologist and by Janet Odom and by Dr. Reeves, that his mother was alive and that she was coming and that what he had been told about her death had not been true. The psychologist had prepared for this conversation to be difficult. She had been trained for the complexity of what it meant to ask a child to reconstruct something this fundamental. Caleb had listened to everything she said. He had been quiet for a long time afterward. And then he had asked, with the directness that people who knew him consistently described as one of his most characteristic qualities, whether his mother knew that he was okay. The psychologist told him yes. He nodded slowly, twice, the way a child does when they're processing something much larger than the words being used to describe it. And then he asked for the markers again and went back to drawing. The meeting between Caleb and Serena has not been publicly described in detail by anyone who was present. Both Serena's legal advocate and the DCS team have consistently declined to characterize what happened in that room beyond the most general terms. What is known is that the nurse on duty that afternoon, a woman named Karen Stiles who had been in pediatric nursing for 23 years, left the floor shortly after Serena went in and stood in the stairwell for 10 minutes before she could compose herself enough to go back to work. She has been asked about it in various contexts since then, and her response has always been the same. She says that after 23 years, she thought she had seen everything. She says some things remind you that you have not. The trial of Richard Harlow began 6 months after his arrest. It lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was constructed around 4 central pillars: the email chain, Dr. Franklin's testimony, the hospital access records, and Dorothy's account of what she had seen at the printer years before. Griffin, Richard's lead attorney, executed the defense that had been promised, arguing misdirection, arguing ambiguous language, arguing that a father's grief had been exploited by an unethical physician who had made independent decisions and then constructed a paper trail that pointed toward his client. He was skilled. He was thorough. He asked questions that were designed to create doubt in exactly the right places, to make the jury feel the weight of what reasonable doubt actually meant, to remind them that the standard was not whether they thought Richard was a bad person, but whether the evidence proved what it needed to prove beyond the threshold the law required. The jury deliberated for 2.5 days. They convicted Richard on 2 of the 3 counts: criminal endangerment and filing a false report. The conspiracy charge, which carried the most significant sentencing implications, was reduced during deliberations to a lesser offense that the jury felt was better supported by the direct evidence. The verdict, when it was read, produced a silence in the courtroom that lasted several seconds before the sound of people reacting began to fill the room. Serena, sitting in the gallery with her legal advocate, did not move. She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the back of Richard Harlow's head, and her expression was one that people around her described differently. Some said it was peace, some said it was grief, some said it was something they could not name. She did not speak to anyone in the room after the verdict was read. She walked out through the side door with her advocate and got into a car and was gone before the media had fully processed what had happened. Richard received a sentence of 4 years in a minimum security facility and was ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution to Caleb and Serena. The sentencing remarks from the judge, a woman who had served on the criminal bench for 14 years, were measured and precise and covered the legal ground that sentencing remarks are required to cover. Near the end, she said one thing that went beyond the formal requirements of the moment. She said that in her 14 years on the bench, she had seen many cases involving the abuse of power and resources against people who had less. She said that what distinguished this case was not the scale of the deception, though the scale was considerable. It was the identity of the victim. A child. His own child. She let the room sit with that for a moment before concluding. Griffin indicated immediately that the sentence would be appealed on multiple grounds. That process has continued through the legal system in the time since. Whether it ultimately succeeds or fails does not change what happened in Room 7 at Mercy General Hospital on a cold March morning. Marcus spent several more weeks at the hospital following the events of that day, not as a patient, but in a capacity that nobody had quite planned for and that the hospital staff handled with a warmth that was broadly noted. He had refused to leave until he knew Caleb was going to be okay. The social worker who was assigned to his case, a woman named Patricia Odom who had been in Child Protective Services for 12 years and who had, in her own account, seen enough of the system to be skeptical of easy outcomes, described Marcus as the most unusual case she had worked in her career, not because of the complexity of his circumstances, but because of the clarity of his character. She spent 3 months navigating the paperwork and the hearings and the bureaucratic machinery of a system that is not built for speed or for simplicity. She encountered obstacles and she pushed through them. She encountered regulations that seemed designed to make the right outcome harder to achieve than the wrong one, and she found ways around them within the rules. She was asked, much later, why she had fought so hard for this particular case. She said it was not complicated. She said she had looked at what Marcus had done and understood that the world owed him something, and that for once she had been in a position to make sure it was paid. By June, Marcus had a bedroom, a twin bed with a blue comforter, a shelf for books, a window that looked out on a street with trees. He was enrolled in school. He had a caseworker who checked in with him weekly and a foster family that the available reports describe as stable, warm, and genuinely committed to his well-being. He did not talk often about what had happened to the hospital. When he was asked about it, in the early weeks, he tended to redirect the conversation or give answers that were so brief they left no room for follow-up. He did not seem to understand why anyone found what he had done remarkable. He had looked through a door and seen a child who needed help. He had helped. That was the whole of it in his accounting. The fact that every adult in that building with significantly more power and training and resources and institutional authority to act had not acted. While he had, this was not something he appeared to think about in the way that people around him thought about it. He simply did not seem to have a framework in which walking past that door was an option he had seriously considered. Caleb was discharged from the hospital in late March. His seizure disorder, properly treated, had stabilized significantly within weeks of correct medication being consistently administered. The prognosis that had been given at his original diagnosis, years before, the one that said his life could be completely normal with proper management, was holding. He was 8 years old. He had been through things that no 8-year-old should have been through, and he had, with the support of the adults now properly surrounding him, begun the long and nonlinear process of building a life that was not defined entirely by those things. He and Serena were navigating what their relationship looked like now with the support of the family therapist that DCS had connected them with. It was slow, and it was complicated, and it was, by every account, real. They were learning from each other. There was time to do that now. There was supposed to be a lot of time. Caleb and Marcus met once, officially, approximately 2 months after the events of that morning. The meeting was arranged carefully by the adults on both sides, with attention to making sure both children felt no pressure and had clear permission to simply be themselves in whatever way that looked like. It lasted about an hour. Neither child said much to the other about what had happened. They played a video game. Marcus, according to the foster parent who accompanied him, beat Caleb 3 times and then let him win the 4th round, which Caleb noticed immediately and called him out on with a directness that made the adults in the room laugh. It was the most ordinary hour imaginable. It was also, by the account of everyone who was there, one of the best hours any of them had experienced in a very long time. This story does not have the kind of ending that fully satisfies. Richard Harlow's appeal is ongoing. Dr. Franklin completed his supervised probation and has not returned to medical practice. The merger that everything was built to protect never happened, and the business empire Richard spent his career constructing is in the slow process of dissolution under the management of a court-appointed receiver. Serena is rebuilding. Caleb is healing. Marcus is in school, in a home, growing up. The hospital implemented new protocols for admission, documentation, and the independent verification of death declarations. Dana Collier, who resigned from her position in the weeks following the events and who has not spoken publicly about her experience, carries something with her that no protocol revision can fully address. The memory of having signed a paper she should not have signed in circumstances designed to make the wrong thing feel like the only available option. She was not charged. The DA's office reviewed her role carefully and concluded that her actions, while consequential, were those of someone who had been manipulated rather than someone who had acted with intent. Whether that finding provided her any comfort is known only to her. What this story is, when you hold all of it together, is a story about what we do when power makes wrongness invisible. Richard Harlow was able to do what he did because he lived in a world where money translated directly into the ability to make inconvenient things disappear. He had done it with Serena. He had done it with Dorothy. He had done it with every person who had come close enough to the truth to be a risk. The systems that should have seen Caleb, the medical system, the educational system, the protective services network, had not seen him because he existed in the particular blind spot that belongs to children whose parents have the resources to manage their visibility. He was alone in that house, with that condition, in that manufactured isolation, and not one structure that existed to protect children had reached him. Until a boy with nothing, invisible to those same systems for entirely different reasons, walked through a door and saw him. The thing that saved Caleb's life was not a system. It was not a protocol or an institution or a trained professional. It was a child who had learned, through years of having no one look out for him, exactly what it looked like when someone needed to be looked out for, and who had not yet learned, or had learned and refused to accept, that looking away was ever acceptable. That is the part of this story that does not resolve into a lesson or a takeaway or a shareable quote. It just sits there, asking something of everyone who hears it. What do we walk past? And what would it cost us, really, to stop? Drop your answer in the comments. Was justice served? For Caleb? For Serena? For Marcus? And what would you have done if you had been the one who looked through that door? This story belongs to everyone who has ever been invisible and everyone who has ever chosen to see. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. And if you are new here, welcome to Behind the Lie. Every story we tell asks one question: what would you have done? Hit subscribe, because the next story coming to this channel involves a secret that was kept for 30 years, a family that built their entire identity on a lie, and the moment one ordinary afternoon unraveled everything. You will not want to miss it.